Well, good morning, everybody. I'm going to start my lecture now, and I'm very pleased to be giving this lecture for the Global University, and I hope you'll enjoy listening to it in wherever you are. But it's nice to have a little bit of an audience here to present it to this morning. So thank you for coming to yet another day of interchange. So the topic of this lecture is researching post-capitalist possibilities, and what I'll be doing is really taking you through some of the steps that I've developed with my colleague Julie Graham and other members of the Community Economies Collective for thinking about how do we act as people trained in humanities and social sciences to contribute to making other worlds possible. And particularly, what capacities do we have as scholars and engaged researchers to interact and shape the world? And of course, one of the capacities that we have as researchers and scholars is the capacity to explore different ways of thinking. So this lecture is really going to be an introduction to different kinds of thinking strategies that we think are needed for the big task of trying to work towards a different kind of world. So what I'm going to do is talk about three kinds of politics: a politics of language, a politics of the subject, and a politics of collective action. And by politics, I mean stepping into that terrain where there is an undecidable kind of way to go forward, and we have some choices to act in certain ways. And so it opens up this possibility for developing new languages, developing new ways of acting as subjects or seeing ourselves as subjects with agency, and of course new ways of collective action. And we've heard a lot over the last few days of all sorts of kinds of collective action. So I'll be talking of a particular kind of collective action that's associated with action research, which is the kind that I've been mainly involved in. So the question is, I guess, why do we need a new way of thinking about post-capitalist possibilities? And well, one of the most urgent reasons is the period in which we now find ourselves in, which has been named the Anthropocene. And this is a period in which Earth systems trends, as you can see documented here by Will Steffen and his colleagues, Earth system trends have got to a point where they're starting to destabilize the long durée, the long period of climate stability that was associated with the Holocene, in which human settlement and agriculture and human civilizations have grown up. So the Anthropocene is a new era, a new geological era, in which human activity is starting to intervene in a way, in an unprecedented way, with Earth system trends. And we see here the impact of human involvement. We see here many trends that show the growth of certain kinds of indicators of natural systems over this period from 1750, when in the Western world industrialization started and the beginnings of mining of coal and use for steam and so on, and the sort of beginning of a fossil fuel-based economies. But what's most important about these graphs is the incredible upswing that happens around 1950, when economic development really spread around the world and developed this incredible kind of generative power to produce more wealth, but also produce more detrimental effects on environments. So carbon dioxide production increased dramatically, nitrous oxide, methane, all the greenhouse gases. But other kinds of interactions took place. Land became cleared, forests became cleared, particularly in tropical regions, and all sorts of degradation started to occur, especially in oceans with the demise of fish species and so on. So we're confronted with this period, and here are the socio-economic trends that are also mapped over this period of time, those that can be. And here we see the incredible growth of population that's occurred, with a huge upswing in 1950, and urban populations as well, to the point now where half the world is living in an urban environment and half in rural. So these are the socio-economic trends that have gone along with economic development in a modernist vein, and these are the trends that are interacting with environmental and planetary systems, to the point where we're facing a real crisis for human survival, but also the survival of many species. It's called the sixth mass extinction is happening now, with the number of species that are being lost because of the changes that are taking place in their habitats caused by these environmental shifts. So we could imagine that that period is also consistent with not just the rise of industrialization, but the rise of a particular kind of economy based on a sort of form of capitalist business and wealth generation that has been often deemed or termed capitalism. But it's also associated with mass industrialization that's happened within socialist economies as well. Most recently, though, we've noticed, and the trends have been mapped, of increasing inequality, particularly in, this is just an example of 4 so-called Anglo-Saxon countries in which Australia, where I come from, is mapped. And we see, this is a graph of income trends or income inequality that was put together by Thomas Piketty from 1910 to 2010. And what we see that for many years during that that period of industrialization through down towards the late 70s, income inequalities in these countries were reducing. So while we had GDP growth and wealth growth, there were mechanisms in place that were distributing income in such a way that inequality was being reduced. But since the late 80s, there's been a huge change and income inequalities are rising. And this could be associated with the kinds of free market neoliberal policies that were introduced at that time, supposedly to generate more growth and supposedly produce more wealth and float all boats, in other words, allow everybody to have a better life. But what's in fact occurred in countries where there had been systems of social democratic redistribution is actually increased income inequality. So these are 2 elements then of the crisis that we face in many countries, increased climate crisis and environmental degradation, but also a period of increased inequality. And I guess in countries where there have been strict measures to try and reduce inequality, particularly in regimes that have been trying to kind of monitor how inequality is working, perhaps these trends aren't as bad, but the environmental issues and planetary issues around climate change are still quite drastic. So I am, and many others around the world, have taken heed of this and taken note of the kinds of warnings that philosophers such as Val Plumwood, who is an eco-philosopher from Australia, a feminist eco-philosopher, who wrote just before she died in 2008 that if our species doesn't survive the ecological crisis, it'll probably be due to our failure to imagine and work out new ways to live with the earth, to rework ourselves and our high energy, high consumption and hyper-instrumental societies adaptively. She writes, we'll go on in a different mode of humanity or not at all. So what she's arguing is that we need to really reshape the way we live in this planet, the way we act, the kind of commitment to high energy, high consumption lifestyles that have been associated with modernity, and this hyper-instrumental separation of economy and ecology that I spoke about a few days ago here. So these are the reasons why we need to research post-capitalist possibilities, why we need to go on in a different way. But there are things that stand in our way. And largely what I would argue stands in our way is a particular vision of the economy as a kind of machine, an economic machine that can't be tampered with, that sets the agenda for what we can and can't do. So it's a very kind of structural and systemic and machinic vision of economy that has developed really consistently over that period that we've seen of industrialization. The kind of economic discourses that have arose have really consolidated this vision of economy, which makes it very difficult to start to think beyond it. And I want to just show you a small video that was made of this the MONIAC, the Monetary National Income Analog Computer, which was developed in the pre-computer days, but it was like an early computer to try and show how the economy worked and according to the kind of economic theories of the time. So. That's a much more hip version of the MONIAC machine than the one that you can get where you see Bill Phillips actually manipulating water around this system. But it's this kind of thinking that we are beholden to this kind of machinic system that really is one of the problems in terms of thinking beyond this. But coming also from, that figuring of the economy is coming out of a more neoclassical and a somewhat Keynesian understanding of economy and the role that the state plays in distributing and regulating monetary flows. But even if we come from a more a structural Marxist perspective, we can also see this kind of vision of capitalism having gone through various waves of crisis and restructuring associated with innovation and technological change. And we have this picture of an ever-evolving system that is always inventive, always able to recover from crisis and move on and set up a new kind of regime of accumulation. So these are very strong narratives that have shaped the way we think about economy, and they stand in the way of thinking beyond this. Is there a way of having a different kind of way of organising the world, thinking of the world? And one of the ways in which we need to move is to sort of start to challenge these representations of capitalism, because what they produce is a sense of the encompassing power of a particular kind of economic relationship, these dynamics that are kind of almost like laws of nature, they're generalizable laws, and of course the agency of action is given to capital and to business, and poor communities are set here kind of cowering in their face. So this is a kind of ridiculous representation, but when you start to put together all the ways in which the capitalist system is discussed, you can see that we've built a monster in our thinking. And this is thinking. So it's having effects. And what Julie Graham and I, as J.K. Gibson-Graham, started to realise in the late 1990s, even though we had been trained in Marxian economics and we were interested in thinking beyond capitalism, what we discovered was that the more we theorised the way in which capitalism worked, the less able we were to think about possibilities beyond it. So we started to critique the representations, the discursive framing of capitalism as a system in order to move beyond it. And I think it's very interesting if we look at the economic theories of development that we have inherited, and here I'm thinking of we as a bigger group, not just those in the West. But here we have a map of, or a graph of, the main 19th century thinkers around economic development, from Adam Smith through to Ricardo, to Marx and to Clark. And all of these theories have been developed in periods of massive population growth and expansion. And this is these major books mapped against the growth of Scotland and a period in which it grew, the population grew from 1 million to 5 million. This is a graph of thinking in the 20th century, from Schumpeter through Keynes, von Hayek, Rostow, right up to Wolfgang Sachs. Again, the main economic theories of development have all been framed within periods of massive population growth. And this is the population of India growing exponentially from the 1800s through to 2010. And so our thinking around economy has been shaped by growth, by expansion, by population growth, and of course by this worry about scarcity. How are we going to live on this world with all this growth? And I think it's interesting to step back and say, well, what kind of economic thinking is going to be needed to start to think about degrowth, or a world in which population has peaked and it's starting to be just at replacement now. So these are the kind of stepping back from a particular way of thinking about economies to question how we think. So what I'm doing here is adopting a very different stance towards knowledge and explanation than the kind of stance that has developed and has informed the economic thinking we've inherited. I would argue that most of these economic theories have come up in a kind of modernist vein, where theory is supposed to be reflecting the real. It's supposed to be tapping into what's out there and reflecting it as this is the way the world is. And what I've done is move to a very different kind of position around knowledge, to see that the way we actually think about things and we construct knowledge has a performative effect. It kind of starts to shape the world we're in. So that's a very different understanding of what knowledge is. And it's also a very different then relationship to what explanation is. Explanation isn't about tapping into the structures that have these dynamics and trying to look below the ideology down to the way the world is really happening. Explanation becomes something that has a much more political and ethical approach. It's really how we construct explanations and how we then that will affect then how we shape and how we interact with the world. So these are kind of as a move from a kind of modernist frame of knowledge making, where the known is usually presented as singular. The known is cumulative. What we do is stand on the shoulders of who came before and try and get a better understanding. And knowledge is seen as somehow neutral. It's something that is really just trying to understand the world. The knower is often someone who sees themselves as an expert, some kind of a master, a person who can have mastery of the world. And knowing is seen to be piercing this veil of ignorance that maybe regular people have, and trying to look down to the roots, the radical roots of what's causing things, and explaining it to the world. Now, of course, that kind of vision of knowledge had a political edge. Marx always talked about understanding the world in order to change it. And on his gravestone, he said, philosophers have sought to change the world, but really we need to understand the world, but really we need to change it. So Marx was very much interested in using knowledge in order to create a better world. But the way in which his knowledge has been taken up, and often perhaps the way even he saw it himself, was still in this kind of modernist framing. That's not to say that many of the things that Marx wrote about are not very useful to us in thinking about shaping the world. But if we move to this kind of other way of thinking about knowledge from a more post-structuralist framing, and this is a framing that has been adopted by many people who are also working within a Marxist tradition. And I'm thinking here of people like Louis Althusser and even Derrida to some extent. This is an anti-essentialist approach to knowledge where the known is multiple, it's contradictory, and knowledge is powerful. It's not neutral. And Foucault, of course, made that argument, the knowledge-power nexus. The knower is one among many knowers. There's many kinds of knowers, and one has to realize and be more kind of humble as a person who's involved in making knowledge, because there are many different ways of knowing. And the most, I guess the most potent way of understanding that is to think about the ways in which Indigenous groups, Indigenous people or First Nations people understand the world with a very different cosmology, a very different way of situating themselves, and a way of knowing that in cases such as the Australian Aboriginals has really supported a lifestyle over 40 to 60,000 years. Now, that's a very different way of knowing the world than the kind of way of knowing that we have developed in our industrial modernist period. So knowing is also experimental, and it has different effects. It produces different effects. So in this perspective, more post-structuralist Marxist dictum might be to understand the world is to change it. So in other words, we need to start thinking about the theories we construct in order to think about the ways in which we're involved in making other worlds. The theories that constrain us versus the theories that enable. And one of the things that we felt most disabled our thinking around making other worlds possible and thinking about post-capitalist possibilities was what we came to call capitalocentrism. And here we're building on the work of Derrida, who talked about logocentrism, and feminists who picked up his work where he talked about phallogocentrism. In other words, a kind of vision of knowledge built around a master signifier, often a more masculinist master signifier, against which, once you have a master signifier, something that is endowed with positive affect and positive is seen as the core of identity, everything else is arrayed in a relationship of subordination or opposition. So in terms of economic thinking, capitalocentrism is a system of knowledge that enrolls all economic identity into capitalism. It positions a wide range of practices as either the opposite of capitalism, a subordinate to capitalism, a complement to capitalism, or somehow existing within its orbit. But in that view, there's no outside. There's no outside to that relation, to capitalism. That everything, all economic identities and practices are always arrayed in this system of knowledge. Now, that has certain effects, and one of the effects is that all these kinds of activities that are happening in different parts of our lives, in different parts of the world, even within the body of developed economies, things that are happening in the household, in the care economy, in the social economy, in cooperatives, in community enterprises, in indigenous-based economies, are all seen as somehow the opposite of capitalism, or about to become capitalism, or subordinated, a complement to or existing within capitalism's orbit. And their own positivity, their own kind of qualities are ignored or are devalued because of that kind of way of thinking. And the similarity to other ways of thinking and these binarisms in Western modernist thinking, you can think of the way in which the figure of the masculine, the man, is the one that has the agency, and the figure of the woman is always the subordinate, the reproductive, the kind of always existing within the orbit, defined in relation to the masculine. And feminists argued, there needs to be a different way of thinking through this. We need to liberate the idea of the positivity of what it is to be a woman, not to see the woman's position as always one of lack in relation to the fullness of the masculine. And this is thinking kind of symbolically, but it also can be seen to inform kind of practical politics as well. So to think outside this binarism, we need a different language of economy. And that's the first kind of intervention that we're interested and we've been interested to make. That if we're going to try and think about post-capitalist possibilities, or possibilities outside of that kind of envisaging of the economy as this systemic machine, then we need a different language to talk about economy. So, of course, we can build on what we have learnt from other theories. And, of course, Marx was very interested in the variety of class relationships. That is one way of differentiating an economy. Unfortunately, the way in which class has often been seen, or class relations have been seen, has been in a sort of stage system. You know, that we had feudalism once, and then we had capitalism, and now, if we're lucky, we'll move to communism or socialism. This kind of stagist vision where the whole mode of production is seen again as in this homogeneous way as one system. But really, what Marx introduced was this idea that class was a process. There was a process of producing, appropriating, and distributing surplus labour, and in different historical contexts, in different kind of enterprise or organisational contexts, that process of producing, appropriating, and distributing surplus labour took on different forms. So he was very interested in mapping out and defining this way that capitalist enterprise employed labour. Labour saw itself as free and freely exchanged labour, but in that free exchange there was an appropriation and distribution taking place of labour, which was then embodied in the sale of the commodity and became surplus value that the capitalist could then accumulate. But he made that argument against the kind of understanding of how this process of class had operated within feudal systems, where farmers were working on land that they had a right to, but the lord allowed them to do this, and in return for that access to the land, half of the week they had to work for the lord. In other words, half of their harvest would flow to the lord, half of their animals and products and so on would flow. So there was a production of livelihood, but an appropriation of some of that wealth, of some of that labour, and that flowed to the landlord or to the feudal lord. And slavery, of course, there's no freedom, and the slave is given a mere amount to live on, and all of their labour is surplus that is then accumulated by the slave owner. But Marx also talked about the possibility that there could be communal class relations or collective class relations where people could work together to produce value using their labour, and they could decide themselves how much they appropriated, how much went back into survival means, you know, what sort of standard of living they would enjoy, and how much could be appropriated and pooled and then distributed both to the collective or perhaps to the wider community. And he also talked about the self-employed or the independent or ancient worker who works for themselves and makes these decisions around the production, appropriation and distribution of surplus labour themselves. And in many cases, independent workers really just work to survive. They rarely make a surplus. So here we have a language of diversity. And if we dissociate this language from a stagist vision and dissociate it from these kind of structural modes of production and see it as a set of processes, we can see that every society has both capitalist and non-capitalist class processes. They actually coexist. And many of us actually participate in multiple class processes. I might work in a factory or as a wage labourer and come home and have a communal household where surplus labour is shared. Or I might work in a capitalist business an entrepreneur and accumulate some capital, but go home and run a very patriarchal household where all the surplus is coming towards me and I distribute to my children and my wife how much I feel like they should have. So in many walks of life, we are involved in many of these class processes. Our subjectivity is determined by multiple class processes. And this is a way of trying to not only diversify the economy, but diversify our own subjectivity. But another way in which we can think about economies as diverse is to think about the way in which commodity production is not the only form of production. And of course, feminists pointed to the fact that a lot of production is happening in households. And this is work that's not paid, like commodity production is usually undertaken by paid labour and then the production is exchanged. And this is the kind of economic data that is collected in the national income and product accounts, for instance, all the kind of transactions of commodities that produce, gross domestic product. But as Marxist economists Sam Bowles and Rick Edwards argued way back in the 1990s, actually, if you look at an economy such as the US economy, we can see there's a huge amount of labour being put into unpaid labour into household production, which is then exchanged and transacted and shared outside of market relations. And then, of course, in most economies, we see a government sector where, again, labour may be paid and you might look like a wage labourer, and some of that work is exchanged, but a lot of it is also directly allocated. So economies have a range of different kinds of labour processes and payment processes, and one could argue that the household production sector and the government sector isn't operating according to the dynamics of capitalism, the kind of ways in which that machinic system that we saw before is operating. So we can start to see that there are both market and non-market transactions. There's paid labour and unpaid labour. There's capitalist class processes and non-capitalist class processes that all make up what we might call as a functioning economy. So I showed this the other day, but we could then start to unpack the variety of labour relations, different kinds of labour, different ways that labour is remunerated, both through different kinds of payment, like reciprocated labour, where you work as a team for another person and then that person works in a team for you. And this is a practice that's been operated in rural communities for centuries, kind of collectively performed reciprocal labour. But there's also labour that's performed in kind, that you come and work for me and I'll pay you a meal or give you some goods, rather than a direct allocation or a direct transfer happening that is not happening through major markets. There's also forms of slave labour and indentured labour and so on coexisting in our world. And similarly, we can start to map out and do an inventory of all the different kinds of transactions, not just formal market transactions that are coexisting in our world, such as fair trade networks, alternative currencies, the whole underground market, the illicit market in drugs or even in e-waste, like we heard about yesterday, and barter, that aren't kind of in these markets where supply and demand is equilibrated and there's free movement and so on. But there's a whole lot then of non-market forms of transacting and sharing, transacting with nature, gleaning, hunting and fishing. Gleaning is that practice of going into a harvested field and picking up what's been left after the harvest. It's a classic practice that has been documented in many different religious traditions and was protected in many cases throughout history because it was a way that the poor, particularly widows, had access to food. But this gleaning is now taking on a modern form. People doing dumpster diving and so on, and gleaning food that's left over or is defined as waste. Of course, we've also seen theft going on. It still goes on, poaching, taking products from other person's land and so on, and gift giving. So there's many kinds of transactions that are keeping people alive, producing livelihoods that we can document. Similarly, when it comes to thinking about enterprise, and enterprise is the context in which new wealth is generated, usually through some kind of class process, so that discussion of class as a process can be used to differentiate different kinds of businesses. So we not only capitalist business where surplus value is being created, but state-owned capitalist businesses or socially responsible businesses where some of the surplus is distributed back to particularly maybe marginalised groups or people with disabilities or environmental ends, and non-profits where the distribution is not being accumulated privately but is being put back into the business. And then all the kind of non-capitalist forms of enterprise, like worker cooperatives, where the workers share the benefit of the labour they've put into production, sole proprietorship or self-employment, community enterprise, which might be a kind of more less formal form of cooperative or collective, and also then feudal and slave enterprise. And then we can add to this the ways in which private property has always been seen as a key aspect of capitalism, but we can see various kinds of private property that operate with more of a commonwealth kind of perspective. So state-managed assets that are managed for the benefit of the nation, or customary or clan ownership, particularly by Indigenous people, where care of the land or resources is taking place, but there is a kind of limit to who has access to that land. So it is private to some extent, but it is being managed for the benefit of a community. Community land trusts are a new element that we're seeing happen, where communities are starting to own the land and share the ownership and keep it in perpetuity for the community, and people have access only to ownership of their houses, but they don't get the incredible kind of value investment rise from property speculation because they keep the land out of the marketplace. And then a lot of other things that become property are still in open access relations. And lastly, then we can think of the diversity of financial systems and financial institutions outside of just regular banks and insurance companies, the kind of credit unions that communities have established to kind of access credit for their own constituency, like many labour unions have their own credit unions, for instance. And all sorts of forms of non-market lending and investment, interest-free loans, ROSCAs, rotating credit schemes, sweat equity, and so on. So this is a different kind of language of diversity in which one can argue there are different kinds of dynamics happening in all these different economic practices. So if we take this kind of reframing, we can ask ourselves, do we live in a capitalist economy, or do we live in a landscape of economic heterogeneity where there's all this difference, and how we work within it is going to be up to us to think of what kind of societies and economies we want to strengthen and which ones we want to disable. So this idea is very easily communicated to people, particularly in who aren't associated with economic thinking or aren't academics or scholars. But it's very easy in a group, in a community, to kind of get people to map out what are the transactions, what are the forms of labour, what kinds of things do they do, and show that a lot of what they're doing is in this kind of below the waterline, the under the waterline part of the economy that's actually keeping things afloat. And this kind of technique is an interesting one to engage people with in order to them to see that they actually have some economic agency. They're not just because they might not be in a job at the moment, they're still doing a lot of things. And these things are adding value and creating benefit. So this kind of technique has been used in a lot of different kinds of community contexts. Here's an artist who has used the iceberg. She's made a 3D model and sits inside it and has discussions with people in fish and chip shops in Glasgow about their role in the economy. This is a different kind of image where we were working in the Pacific region, where an iceberg didn't seem to be the right kind of image to use in the tropical region, so we used the idea of a floating coconut. And here we got people to map out what are the activities they're involved in, say over the last week, and very few of them are involved in formal economic activities in the formal marketplace. Most of them are involved in informal activities, non-cash activities, and we also use this as a way of mapping out the work that women did and the work that men did, and they got to see the incredible variety of a range of activities, particularly that women did. Men were quite surprised, I think. So we could use this kind of inventory to actually look at one particular place or a community and start to map out all the different things that are making this local community work. And I'll just very quickly go through some images from research done in a small rural community in the Philippines, where the number of people in formal waged work is quite small, but the number of people in what we might call alternative paid work is quite large. So there's people working as porters in a cooperative, there's many self-employed farmers and drivers and so on. But there's also people working for different kinds of payments, paid in kind and paid through reciprocal labour, particularly in harvesting and group work on people's land. And then there's a whole lot of unpaid labour that contributes to the community. Building, like for instance, the chapel that was built by this notion of bayanihan, which is a kind of communal helping out, but also childcare, other kinds of unpaid labour that takes place and is organised in this kind of informal way. When it comes to transactions, again, there's mainstream retailers who we can document, but there's also local trading systems. There's a lot of what people call a suki trading, where a small business, a woman would have a small store to provide goods and services, mainly small food items, and the relationship with the consumer is often quite personal. So people will get their food or buy their things and not pay for a month because they don't have the money, and later on they'll pay. So there's all sorts of informal ways of tracking the transactions and helping people out. And then, of course, there's all sorts of ways of raising funds. And again, the language that is associated with different kinds of fundraising, revolving credit or group savings, is very interesting to look at how there's a language of economic diversity. And there's also gifting that takes place in this community. For everyone gifts money when someone dies to help with their funeral. There's also a lot of gifting that happens around particular fiestas and so on. We can also look at the relationships with nature, beachcombing, which is a kind of form of gleaning, just going out and collecting seafood. But there's also a lot of illegal relations with the environment, and illegal quarrying or informal quarrying is a big problem in many of the regions in the Philippines and lead to a lot of problems with landslides and so on. So this inventory is not an inventory of the things that are good. It's an inventory of just everything. And because then we can start to say, well, what would we like to strengthen? So when we come to capitalist corporations, there's provincial corporations like a fish farming business, a large mine in this area, mining limestone, a transnational corporation. But then there's a whole lot of small businesses, retail stores, and also state enterprise, in this case the port and the ferry system. And also then non-capitalist enterprises. There's an interesting social enterprise that's been developed mainly to employ people who are deaf, a cafe that's run as a social enterprise. And of course, cooperatives. This is a cooperative store. And then small businesses like the the independent sari stores and the ice cream store and market vendors. Again, all very small businesses. And then, of course, subsistence farmers, people who are working for their own self-provisioning, and fishermen, and then are kind of the remnants of feudalism, or the still very prominent aristocratic kind of land holdings that are then employing tenant farmers, particularly in plantations like mango plantations and banana plantations. So this is a form of feudal enterprise. And there's also forms of child labour, child bonded labour, which is a form of slavery that still exists. So you can see that in one particular place, a small community, all the variety of economic activities that you can document. But you can also use this kind of analysis to look at an economic sector. And I showed this diagram the other day. This is someone who's tried to map out the sector of seed production and the different kinds of economic activities and enterprise control of seeds in the formal capitalist economy, but in the kind of informal commons-based economy as well. And other people have used this kind of imaging to analyse things like the communications sector. And this is a diagram from Korea in a community workshop where people used the idea of a prickly cactus with a big root system underneath it. And the cactus was representing the mainstream media that's very prickly, that keeps the community away and in fact often misrepresents the community. Whereas there's an underground system of community media, community radio and so on, that actually serves the community. And the mobile phone is sort of sitting at the edge of the top of the soil there, because it can go both ways. It can be a vehicle for mainstream media, but it can also be a vehicle for the community. And we heard the other day about the importance of having community media in a situation such as in Venezuela to kind of counter the way that dominant media dominates the news waves. And this is another kind of image that was produced in a workshop in Korea about mainstream finance being a kind of a gilded cage, and the kind of community currencies that are outside that cage that are allowing people to have access to finance in different ways, crowdfunding and time banking and so on. So this is a way of thinking about a different language of economy that frees us up from that kind of machinic vision. It doesn't tell us what to think. It just helps us inventory the diversity and asks us to start to theorize those relationships between those economic activities, not to presume that the relationships are all dominated or determined by certain kinds of dynamics that are associated with a particular set of activities. So secondly then, how does this impact then the question of subjectivity and the politics of the subject? Because it's all very well to have a different kind of language, but we need to inhabit that language and start to act differently if we want to activate ethical dynamics rather than these kind of be beholden to the structural dynamics that we are told run this machinic economy. So here we're very interested in thinking about activating economic subjectivities that are not dominated by these ones. And we saw from that little video the way in which these economic subject positions are normalized. Everybody is needing to have a wage or wants to buy more. You know, the kind of way that those balls moved around that system were associated with economic subjects who desired higher wages, more profits, cheaper goods, capital gains, more private returns. And over the past few days, we've heard a lot about people feeling like these things, and of course it's associated with wanting to be a consumer. These kinds of subjectivities are very hard to challenge. But we know that all of us are involved in other kinds of economic subject positions, as parents, as carers, some as unemployed people, as volunteers, as self-employed, and so on. So there are many, there's a diversity of economic subject positions that we negotiate, and it's a matter of how do we activate other subjectivities that will allow us to start to build different kinds of economies, and that's the challenge. So in a second book that Julie and I wrote, A Post-Capitalist Politics, we really grappled with this question of how do we think about subjectivity change, or resubjectivation, as Foucault would talk about it. And we really did this through our practice of involvement with communities in action research. And one of the things that we thought about and we engaged with was this very resistance to being a different kind of economic subject. So we got involved in this notion of the processes of how do we become subjects of different kinds of economies. And one of the techniques that we employed was building on other work that many community activists have used, which is a kind of strengths-based approach, where you use assets and document the assets people have as a way of thinking through action. And I'll show you this in a minute, how the notion of documenting assets as opposed to needs has this kind of effect on people that helps them think through adopting different kinds of subject positions. So in the work we did in the Philippines, as people in the Philippines love acronyms, they came up with this idea that we could mix asset-based community development, ABCD, with diverse economy framing, DEF, and have this wonderful system of ABC, DEF. So the assets-based community development has been developed by people in the US, Kretzmann and McKnight, with working particularly in urban communities with unemployed youth and people who are out of work. And their idea was to start to map the assets that people had, the assets that were involved in local associations and in businesses and physical infrastructure. And they came up with this idea of juxtaposing the assets that community have with the needs. Because anyone that's done work in communities will find that as soon as you start discussing what needs to happen, people often get fixated on all their problems, all the things we don't have, all the ways in which things aren't working, the ways in which we need someone to come in from outside to help us. And they were very interested in shifting that victim-subject position and saying, let's actually look at what you do have. Let's build on what we have. Let's start from now. Let's start with what we have. And so this idea of the assets map is a very interesting kind of technique that shifts the disposition of people when they do it. And it's quite different from the technique of using the SWOT analysis, which some of you might be familiar with, that strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, kind of 4x4 or 2x2 kind of matrix. And once you start putting all the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats out there, you'll find that the weaknesses and threats always become huge and the strengths and opportunities always seem to diminish. Whereas when you do the needs map, you can put the needs out there and put them to the side and then start thinking about assets. And the affect, the kind of bodily affect, is quite different. So in our work, we started to do this assets mapping by doing that kind of inventory, as I showed you before. For instance, looking at the diverse economic practices in a community that could be drawn into building different kinds of economies. And for instance, I did some work very early on with migrant workers in domestic workers in the Philippines that were from the Philippines and Indonesia who came to Hong Kong. This is a demonstration, I think in 1982 in Hong Kong, and I was starting out in this work. And these were people who are working as domestic helpers, and really they are indentured labourers. So they're working on contracts, they're relatively unfree, they have one day off a week, but they can't go back home except for the end of the contract in 2 years. So it is a form of indenture, just like many Chinese labourers were indentured labourers that came to Australia and built railways and so on. They again were tied into a contract that was a form of slavery. And of course, many of these women are leaving their own children at home to come and work and look after other people's children. But what the Asian Migrant Centre in relation and in concert with Unlad Kabayan, an NGO that I've worked with for many years, started to do was to help the women form savings groups using their meagre income, but saving a little bit for themselves to pool to start to invest in other kinds of enterprises back in the Philippines. Instead of allowing their funds to flow back to the families to be used for super consumption, which is often what happens. People send their money back. Often it's just to pay the school fees and to help with food, but if there is a surplus, it's often put into consumption goods. This organisation started to work with women to pool money to start to invest in other enterprises. And this is a small community enterprise that was begun in the community we worked with, where older women were wanting to develop an enterprise based on the ginger that was grown in the region, and they produced this ginger powder, ginger tea powder called salabat, which they would sell to the local community. And their idea was to build enterprises that would mean that younger women could start to work in these enterprises rather than having to go overseas to work as domestic helpers. So this was a kind of subject position shift where indentured labourers became investors. So they've got multiple subject positions here. And older women who are working as farmers became entrepreneurs. So there's a kind of interesting subjectivity shift that started to happen. And in this group, they started to use not just local resources, but they employed these diverse economic assets, this idea of reciprocal labour exchange. They even used patronage networks to sell their products, barter, and so on, to start to generate surplus to put it back into the community. Another group of people that a colleague of mine, an artist, has been working with for a number of years in London. Again, there was older people from East London who were children of factory workers, and in their youth, when they were kids, every summer their mothers would take them over to the fields of Kent where the hops were grown to make beer, and they were employed as harvesters. So the women would work as harvesters and the children would work a little bit and stay in these work camps, and that was their summer holiday. And they had many fond memories of being outdoors, camping, living together. And as older people, they've been interested in revisiting these regions, but not just that. This artist, Katherine GIBSON, has got them involved in gleaning and collecting and picking in the London area, and actually producing a set of what they call company drinks. So what she's drawn there is the drinks cabinet with the formal Coca-Cola and mainstream drinks, and then opening up the cabinet to all the different economic practices that can be drawn into creating a community enterprise built around community drinks based on harvesting elderflower and making elderflower syrup, blackberries and so on. And here we have the kind of circuits of value that are flowing. They're keeping some of the drinks products to be used in the community and sold at one level, and then others flowing out to the art museums and so on, and sold for a higher level outside of the community. So again, a subjectivity shift from feeling like you're old and out of it and not involved anymore to becoming involved in this enterprise and getting involved with younger people. Another example of this work, I conducted a lot of research in a coal mining area of Victoria in Australia, where this is an image from the early 20s when this region was developed for brown coal mining by the Victorian state. So there was all the mines and the electricity generation was done by state enterprise. But at the time that our project began, the state enterprises were all being privatised and sold off. And so many people lost their jobs. And our project was working with unemployed workers and young unemployed people and single mothers who were also disadvantaged in this area. And so one of the techniques we used to help subjectivity shift was to actually allow people to express the pain of losing their job. This was the kind of needs analysis, that we need a job, but look what's happened. I've lost my job. There's privatisation. There's the footprints of the industrial worker, kind of like walking across the landscape as a ghost. And now the only growth industry are shops that are selling second-hand goods and so on. So this is a kind of way of getting the feelings surfaced in order to move on. So that's Jock's story, the unemployed retrenched worker who's middle-aged and doesn't feel like they have anywhere to go. This is the photo essay of the young unemployed people who see themselves as only in the valley of the dole. That's, in other words, getting unemployment benefits. It's a play on a famous novel called The Valley of the Dolls, an American novel. So they documented the life of an unemployed youth, just going to the government agency to get your unemployment benefit, then just, you know, smoking, going to McDonald's and having no kind of life, no future. And so this project started to work with people to build on their assets and develop community-based enterprises, a youth circus, a community gardens, and a workshop, a Sanders workshop. So the idea of subjectivity shift is to kind of work with people around moving away from this victimhood kind of position to thinking about what can be enabled. And I can talk a bit more about that if you need, but time is getting on. And of course, more recently, we've been involved in thinking about the subject as not just a human subject, but a more than human subject. And this is the topic, in a way, of the film, The Bamboo Bridge, that was shown here the other day, where we can start to think about the agency not just of people working on that bridge, but also the agency of the bamboo that's part of that bridge, and the way in which working together with bamboo and learning its cycles and working with its cycles as really producing a different way of surviving well. So moving on then, I think I've already started to touch on the ways in which collective action can be based on this kind of different kinds of politics of language and politics of the subject. Because when it comes to collective action, we're really thinking about how do we strengthen and build community economies, these different kind of more ethical economic activities. And so this was the topic of our book, Take Back the Economy, which was more recently produced and has been translated into a number of languages. And it's really a kind of a manual for communities to think about working together to build economies in which surviving well together is put at the core of what work is. Distributing surplus back to the community and to the environment is what the core of business is. So the community economy concerns are where surviving well is put at the centre of what work is. Distributing surplus is at the centre of what business is. Ethical encounters with others is put at the centre of what transactions are. Commoning is put at the centre of property relations. Investing in futures is put at the centre of what finance is. And consuming sustainably is put at the centre of everything. So again, this is where this inventory can be sort of shifted away from the subjectivities that are associated with just making money and consuming more to these kinds of more ethical considerations. Commoning and investing in futures. And in the book we outline a lot of different kinds of techniques of working with people to think through these issues and think through how to shift towards these more ethically oriented community economies. And we've workshopped a lot of these ideas in different contexts in which the books have been translated. So just one example is working in Colombia with women who have worked for many years in the export flower industry, working in these kinds of hothouses, very toxic environment where they go from very hot, humid environments to very cold environments where they take the flowers to be refrigerated before they get shipped off to the rest of the world. They've led a very, very difficult life, and they're involved in trying to develop other kinds of ways of living. And so they did an exercise around this idea of surviving well, documenting the different kinds of labour they did over the past week and the kinds of well-being it created and the different kinds of ecological footprints it had. So here's a group, ex-flower industry workers and their daughters, doing this 24-hour clock kind of analysis of how they spend their life, how they spend their work life, and what kind of well-being it creates, both material well-being, occupational well-being, social well-being, community and physical well-being. And they also wanted to add into our kind of scorecard environmental well-being and spiritual well-being. So to what extent were they getting time for life versus time for working for someone else, and what kind of well-being did it create? And they had been involved in trying to set up, and this is an exercise where when they came together with other groups, they were modelling and trying to redraw economies and think about economies. And here they showed with this kind of diorama or this little kind of map using local products. This is the work down here in the hothouses, which is the exploitative international flower industry, which takes about 90% of the water on the Bogota plains. And with their daughters and with some of the people who are no longer working in the industry, they set up on the top right-hand side a community garden where they would start to farm themselves and created their own sociality, eating together, doing reciprocal labour and producing a different kind of well-being. And after a few years, that land was then requisitioned by the council, so it really taps into this question of commoning and uncommoning. But this was a way of people having that conversation of what kind of economy do they want to be involved in, and documenting that. So those techniques can be used to help people shift and think about economic experimentation. So when we're thinking about then taking back business and thinking about distributing surplus, the question is, how do we generate and distribute society's surplus? And here we've introduced the idea of an ethical audit sheet where we start to think about how much we're being paid in the jobs we have, how much surplus is being generated, and then within businesses, where does that surplus flow? How much of it flows into the business costs, how much it flows to a private class, or how much does it flow to other societal and environmental ends? And this is using this technique in a workshop in Quebec, in Montreal, amongst a lot of people who are involved in all sorts of organisations here. In the social economy, different kinds of housing organisations, in agriculture, in food, and different kinds of projects. And they started to do this mapping of their own people's account of their enterprise. And mainly, of course, with many of these economic experiments, their survival payments are very low. They're working very long days to make a living. And it's subsidised by, their survival is subsidised by volunteering. In many of these experimental enterprises, they haven't generated any surplus yet. And yet a lot of their, the income that they're developing is having to be used to be paid to taxes and different kind of rent payments to the state. And so they were very interested in trying to organise together to ask or to make sure that the state doesn't legally start to require things that are unnecessary. And these people were people working outside of the kind of social economy that's more supported by the Quebec state, which is quite a large section of the economy there in Canada. So these were more kind of anarchistic organisers who'd come out of a different kind of movement were slightly critical of the social economy that's very supported by the Quebec state, but also realising that they needed to have a different relationship to the state in order to make their enterprises sustainable. And in the case of Colombia, bringing people together from a different range of areas in Colombia came up with a new enterprise, this idea of a Colombian chocolate bar where products from one region and would be brought together, and they already, in the period after this, the redrawing economy workshops, people started to develop a new product. And interestingly, the cover is designed to kind of indicate the relationship that people have with nature in that area, coming out of a very different cosmology. Okay, I'm probably way over time, so I probably should just quickly finish by saying we've also been involved in a project on manufacturing, and manufacturing is, of course, industrial manufacturing is one of the great contributors to the Great Acceleration. It's an area where, you know, these products, aluminium, concrete, plastics and synthetic fibres are being produced. And we've been interested in engaging with manufacturers around the question of just sustainability. Like, can we manufacture in a way that produces a better quality of life for all now and into the future in a just and equitable manner, while still living within the limits of supporting ecosystems? And that's taking Julian Aguiman's kind of definition of just sustainability. And we've worked with a diverse range of enterprises. Some of them are global public corporations, some of them are social enterprises, some are private companies, others are producer co-ops, to show how they're working. And this is the kind of the stockpile of carpet tiles by Interface, who are very interested in expanding their reuse and re-entry rather than always producing new carpets. And they're also they've signed up in the past 20 years to Mission Zero, which was a kind of a setting an agenda so that they weren't creating more demands on the environment. They were recycling their old product and then using regenerative biofuels in their production of new carpet. But now they've signed up to a new agenda, which is called Climate Takeback, where on their factories, and this is the picture of the factory in western part of Sydney, they're saying we want the ecological services on this footprint, this factory site, to be equal to the ecological services that would be produced in this natural environment in this same area. So this is the forest not very far away from this factory area in New South Wales, and they're documenting what the ecological services of this region would be and saying, how can we make our factory footprint have the same benefit to the environment? They don't know how they're going to do this, but they're committed to do it. And this is an interesting kind of innovative agenda that this company has taken on over the years, committing to these kinds of ethical and ecological agendas and then innovating in order to meet them. Another of the enterprises is a social enterprise, Soft Landing, just here, which does mattress recycling but has led the way in a voluntary stewardship kind of scheme with all the retailer and private capitalist producers of mattresses, and then undoes the mattresses and the materials go back into steel production and other kinds of production. But the interesting thing here is that a social enterprise which is committed to employing people who are long-term unemployed, people who have come out of prison and can't get jobs elsewhere, this social enterprise is leading the sector to sign up to a voluntary stewardship program where when you buy a mattress, you'll know that it already has money set aside to have it properly recycled at the end of its life. So our project has been interested in the diversity of enterprises in manufacturing who can be part of a solution to environmental crisis and can also start to produce more equal societies. And this is a quote from one of the CEOs of one of the companies saying, manufacturing in Australia, if it's done in a way that has benefit from a sustainability, from a footprint point of view, then you would have a competitive advantage. He said Australia has to move because overseas is moving. China is moving. China is not staying still. So it's kind of interesting that there's already a recognition that China has adopted many of these principles, and that if Australia wants to keep producing, it has to also step up to these kinds of agendas. Lastly, talking about property, when property is seen as a relationship between people with respect to things, then we can think about commoning all forms of property. Common property isn't just associated with publicly owned property. And in the book we use this commons identikit to identify whether something is a commons or not, and it's not tied into the legal issue of the legality of the property, but really whether there's a community that's taking charge of sharing access, negotiating use, distributing benefit, taking care and taking responsibility. So there's a kind of way in which we can think about commoning always taking place, creating new commons, commoning enclosed property and commoning unmanaged open access resources. And the work is to kind of do this movement away from the narrow access or the unrestricted access to a shared and wide access. Moving away from restricted use or open and unregulated use to use that's negotiated by a community. Moving away from private benefit or the kind of benefit of the finder and keeper of an open access resource to the distribution to a community that's defined. Care being taken by the community members, not by just the owner or the employee, and then responsibility being taken by a community. And we can look at these processes of commoning and uncommoning taking place all around us. In the case of the Bamboo Bridge, we can see a form of uncommoning beginning now with the concrete bridge going over to this island, which has been managed as a community commons, even though privately owned, but a certain kind of rural lifestyle has been maintained over centuries. But now there's going to be the opportunity for property development and the uncommoning of this kind of environment. But we can also think about commoning at an atmospheric level, and the way in which communities have been mobilised over time to start to think about the pollution of the atmosphere. And if we think about the early actions, we can think about the Clean Air Acts that were introduced in Britain in the early 60s to respond to this kind of situation. This is in 1953. The quality of air in London, which was so polluted because of coal-fired burning of heating and so on. So these Clean Air Acts were introduced in the 1960s or late 1950s, and then later on we've seen all sorts of new regulations to start to common and take care of the ozone hole in our atmosphere. And this is one example of a kind of global scale collective action that is having an impact, and we need to take some lessons from this kind of activity to think about how we're going to challenge these much greater challenges of climate change that I started off with. So the politics of collective action are using language, using subjectivity change to make post-capitalist possibilities more real, thinking about these kinds of issues and negotiations that need to take place if we're going to move towards a different kind of economy and a different kind of future. So these Earth system trends and these socio-economic trends are very challenging, but as I've shown, we have started to manage the stratosphere, the stratospheric ozone hole. We have started to see population turnaround, and we need to think about the economic theories that are and economic thinking that's going to be useful in this post-Anthropocene age, where a post-growth kind of agenda needs to be put up front. Hopefully feminism will play a role and other forms of commoning will play a role. So thank you very much for your attention.